What is up, my friend? I hope you're doing well, and welcome back to another video. So this one in particular is one I wanted to do for a long time, especially because I think a lot of composers who are just starting out are feeling a little bit lost and a little bit stuck when it comes to orchestration and using virtual instruments for their productions. So my goal for you by the end of this video, if you are kind of in that boat, is that you can walk away with confidence when it comes to arranging and orchestrating your next piece of music using the symphony orchestra and kind of understand a framework for actually approaching your music with confidence and doing it consistently every single time. All right. So before we really get into the meat of everything, though, I want to give you a free gift just to start things off. This guide I put together is called 5 Orchestration Mistakes to Avoid. It's super practical, super didactic, and essentially by the end of this guide, you'll basically discover the 5 key orchestration mistakes that amateur arrangers make. You'll also be able to think about the orchestra in a more musical and expressive way rather than as like a pianist and thinking from a choral perspective. You'll think of it from a more melodic and musical perspective. In addition, you'll learn idiomatic writing techniques for the best results so that your orchestra actually sounds realistic and convincing. And you'll learn some good practices for balanced chords and full textures. I think a lot of amateur mockups, kind of feel unbalanced and almost unmusical because of certain aspects of the music making process we might not consider. So this guide will kind of ensure that you avoid all of these mistakes and you can approach every single piece you write with confidence. So to access this, it's totally free. Just click the first link in the description box below and you can download it as my gift to you for checking out this video today. All right, without further ado, let's kind of dive in. So I wanted to give or share a very quick background when it comes to sampling in general. So what is sampling? Sampling really is the recording of a source. It could be an instrument, it could be any sort of sound, and utilizing it in a unique situation. So usually that's going to be for our productions, for our purposes, when we're trying to put together a mock-up, a cue, or maybe we're writing a song, or we're putting together some background textures, but we just need some extra sounds. Sampling is when you're taking an original source and you're utilizing it in a different situation. The first sampled keyboards kind of came out in the 60s, so 1960s and the 1970s. Examples include the Mellotron and the Synclavier keyboards. Those were some really iconic samplers. Then orchestral sampling kind of bloomed in the 90s. So you have libraries like Miroslav and Peter Silaksek. Sorry, I'm totally mispronouncing that, but they were kind of pioneers in the industry. And then after that, we kind of got Native Instruments Contact, right, in 2002. And then Steinberg also published Hallion in the same year as well. In addition to that, VSL introduced true legato sampling in the same year, 2002. And East West introduced their Quantum Leap symphonic orchestra, platinum, gold, and silver in 2003. So this is the first orchestral library to contain multiple mic positions and was the first orchestral library to be recorded in Hollywood. So East West and VSL kind of set the stage for orchestral sampling from then on out. But it's just really cool to see how, very shortly after the initial sampling methods came out in the 60s and 70s, orchestral sampling kind of bloomed and really took off later. So in the 80s, 90s, and now we have just plenty of choices available to us, right? So you might be asking, like, why should we actually care about sample libraries in the first place? And honestly, the technology we have today allows us to create extremely convincing orchestral mockups. Think 50, 60 years ago when we didn't have this technology. If you wanted orchestral instruments in your music, you'd have to hire live players, hire a real orchestra. And why is that the only option, right? So when technology kind of came out, it allowed us essentially to capture the orchestra in a box and use it for our own purposes. So that in itself is a great reason to care, I think, as musicians. Also, the tools are just more affordable than ever before, so you can get started very easily. You have free options for the Contact player, so you literally don't have to spend any money if you already have a computer and a DAW. You can get started very, very quickly and very, very easily for free. It also helps us to learn more about the instruments as a whole and individually. If you think about it, when you listen to live recordings of an orchestra, you're hearing all the instruments playing as an ensemble at once. So it's very difficult to hear the instruments individually and pick out what they're doing. So most good sample libraries will contain these individually recorded instruments so you hear what the timbres sound like, how they kind of function, how the players breathe, and how the instruments kind of work together when you start layering them together, which is really cool. It also keeps us up to date on music technology, because if you stay updated with sample libraries and you see how they're scripted and what they're kind of shipped with, then you essentially see what the market is putting forth and how they're kind of innovating, what they're putting in their libraries, and you get a really good sense of how the industry is kind of moving as a whole. So let's talk about the upsides of sample libraries. Why would you want to use sample libraries? Well, first of all, you have full control over every single instrument, so this makes things very flexible. If I'm putting together an orchestration from start to finish, right? And if I want to bring that piece of music to a live orchestra, well, if they're playing all together as an ensemble and, like, let's say one or two people play a wrong note, well, then you have to re-record that entire section, or that entire piece of music, right? And that can waste a lot of time and a lot of money. But if you have sample libraries and you can control the MIDI notes, then it allows you simply to adjust the notes as you want to, and the libraries will do it right away very efficiently. So the flexibility you get with sample libraries is simply unparalleled compared to a real orchestra. Also, they're a fraction of the cost compared to hiring a live orchestra. Hiring a live ensemble can cost anywhere from a few $100s to, let's say, tens of thousands of dollars for a high-end one, and sample libraries usually cost in the low thousands. Like, the most expensive ones are usually between $1,000 and $2,000, and the cheap ones, again, are like free. So it really is a no-brainer when you're getting started. Also, it's just super convenient because you can download these sample libraries and work from your home studios. You can contain them on your computers or on your external hard drives. Whatever the case, you don't have to leave home. You can literally make music that sounds awesome on your computer. Such a great reason to use sample libraries. Also, you can discover different instrument timbres, dynamic and playable ranges, and idiomatic tendencies, right? Like we talked about before, you can hear the individual instruments when you download sample libraries, compared to if you're hearing a live orchestra, the instruments are all playing together. So it's like one singular sound, right? So sample libraries give you that flexibility as well. And finally, they can also spark creative ideas that you might have never considered before. So maybe there's like unique sound design patches. Maybe you have instrument combinations that you haven't tried before, like oboes and trumpets or something. And, they just give you an option to experiment and have fun and come up with new ideas. And again, it comes down to the flexibility and the convenience of having these libraries. Now, of course, with upsides, there will always be downsides. So what are some downsides of sample libraries? Well, first of all, if you're going for realism, nothing will ever sound as realistic as a live ensemble performing together. It's just the way it works, right? When you have performers performing at the same time, being conducted by a real person, there's expression and natural human emotion that goes into the performances that you just don't get with a sample library, because sample libraries are simply snapshots of performances instead of complete performances being played in real time. Also, this is a financial thing. Collecting sample libraries can become super addictive. We have what's called GAS, gear acquisition syndrome, in our niche. And this is essentially when you're collecting gear, it becomes so much fun and you just want the newest shiny object. And so it can cost you a lot of money, especially if you're just doing it as a hobby. You might not be able to afford all those sample libraries that are coming out on a regular basis. Also, they can be quite expensive in general for the hobbyist. So like we mentioned before, it can cost up to like $2,000 for a single library. And if you want dedicated orchestral sections, that's like 4 $2,000 libraries that can cost you basically $10,000 just to complete your core orchestra. Obviously, there are many cheaper options, but just so you know, if you collect many of them, then they can cost a lot of money. Also, if you become accustomed to a particular sound or the scripting of a particular library or developer, like let's say Cinesamples or Orchestral Tools or Spitfire Audio, then you might think that that's the only definitive way that an instrument should sound. But do keep in mind, right, what you're hearing is just one company's take or one musician's take on their instrument. Whereas if you listen to live performances, you actually hear the instruments in their natural habitat performing together. So sample libraries, although they're super effective and very, very convincing nowadays, if you only pay attention to one single sample library, let's say for each section, you only have one string library, one woodwind library, one brass library, then each library has its own unique sound for those instruments. And that might put you in a little bit of a mental box to say, okay, this is exactly how brass should sound, or exactly how woodwinds or strings should sound, right? Whereas that might not exactly be the case. And finally, I think, the pros just simply outweigh the cons. Like we just talked about the downsides and the cons of sample libraries, but actually, the pros of using them, personally, to me, outweigh the cons. The flexibility and the convenience of having them offsets the price you have to pay financially to acquire them. I've personally learned so much through sample libraries and, in terms of dynamic ranges, playable ranges, and as more libraries come out in similar sections, like more string libraries every single month come out, more woodwind libraries, more percussion libraries, they give you a different twist on the same thing. So you learn more about the instruments, you learn more about how they're sampled, how they work, and it's just a really beautiful way to learn about the orchestra. So you might be asking at this point, if you're getting started, what do you actually need? Like what equipment do you need to get started? Well, first of all, you need a computer with a DAW, right? So a DAW is a digital audio workstation. Examples of these include Logic, Ableton, Pro Tools, Cubase, Reaper, Studio One, whatever. Like there are so many options nowadays, and they're pretty affordable as well. You also need speakers or headphones. So speakers being like monitors that sit on your desk, or headphones that just plug into your ears. And these are specifically meant for playback and listening, so you can hear exactly what you're producing and go from there. You will also need a MIDI controller. This is very important. It's like an electronic keyboard that sits on your desk so you can play the different parts in instead of having to use your mouse to click in and input all the notes manually. These can range anywhere from a couple $100s to, let's say, $3,000, and the ranges go even past this. But for a good quality one, I would say anywhere between $1,000 to $2,000, you can get a really nice MIDI controller. An audio interface is optional, but usually you want to use that to run your equipment through so that the sounds are as clean and pristine as possible. But some audio interfaces also have a character sound to them, so it really depends on what you're looking for. But they're especially effective when you have a microphone as well. So if you want to run a microphone through an audio interface, which then connects to your computer, then the audio interface essentially allows you to convert the incoming audio signal into readable information for the computer. So that's kind of interesting. And yeah, just overall, you can create a pretty quality setup for less than $2,000. Let's say you already have a computer, or you had to buy a computer for a few $100s, and then a DAW, let's say Logic, right? Costs $200. So let's say that's $600-700. Speakers or headphones, they don't cost that much if you want to be affordable. Let's say a few $100s there, so that's already $1,000. MIDI controller, let's say we go with a $500 one. Microphone can be a few $100, and audio interface is usually between $100-200. So for around $2,000, you already have a pretty good setup. But let me share with you what I personally use. So in terms of my computer, I use a 2017 iMac, which has a 4.2 gigahertz quad-core Intel Core i7, and I also have 64 gigabytes of RAM. So this cost me around $3,000. Of course, I'm not just using this computer for music, but also for recording videos like this, for doing work, for my office, etc. I'm also using Logic Pro. I should have included that, which is $200. Then I also have the Kali Dual monitors, which are around $300, and I have my basic Apple EarPods, which are $25 nowadays. For my MIDI controller, I have the Arturia Keylab 88. I really enjoy this one because it simulates a live real piano very well with the weighted keys. So this one runs you about $1,000. For my audio interface, I use the Apogee One, which is about $250. And my microphone for recording my voice is the Blue Blueberry, which costs $1,000. Finally, for hosting my sample libraries, I have external hard drives. So I have the WD My Passport. I have two of those, which are 4 terabytes each, and they cost $150. And then finally, I have external SSDs as well. These are the Samsung Portable T7 SSDs, and they are 1 terabyte each, and they cost about $250 a piece. So that's just my personal setup. I can do another video showing more in depth what I use, but just so you get a sense of my setup, these are my personal choices for equipment. So now let's dive into the orchestra as a whole. It's comprised of 4 core sections, right? There's the string family, there's the woodwinds, there's the brass, and there's the percussion. They all serve different roles, but they all contribute to the larger whole of the orchestra, which is beautiful. So yeah, each one contributes a different color to the ensemble. And this is one thing I'm going to come back to a lot, is thinking about the orchestra in terms of color. So the strings have a very homogeneous sound, and the instruments are all relatively similar to one another. They have similar constructions, they do differ in size and therefore in range, but generally the playing techniques and the overall sound is quite similar across the board. Then we have the woodwind family, which is kind of the opposite of the strings. They have very unique colors. Every single instrument has a different sound to it, and they're generally used for texture, like adding definition, or playing flourishes like runs and trills and stuff, or they can also carry their own melodies, right? Every section of the orchestra can do these roles, but typically they serve some pretty standard functions. Then we have the brass family, which typically plays fanfares and adventure very, very well and like fantasy, but they can also play delicate, warm passages equally well in addition to that. Think about French horns, think about tubas and trombones playing at a softer dynamic, just a very beautiful sound that you get there. And then finally, you get the percussion section, which is typically used to highlight key moments in an arrangement or in a piece. And they can also just decorate existing arrangements, like maybe you want a little tinkle here and there, or you want the occasional thump. They don't necessarily have to keep things in time, but maybe they're just decorating the arrangement. So very versatile, the orchestra in general, but just so you know, these are some typical uses for these sections. So let's talk about each section in a little bit more depth. Let's start with the strings. And we basically have 4 different instruments in the family. So we have violins, violas, celli, and basses. The violins are the highest section of the strings, and they typically carry lead melodies, or they can easily support the rest of the orchestra just by playing other sorts of textures. Then we have the violas, which are like a bridge between the violins and the cellos. So they're a bit lower than the violins, but higher than the cellos. They're not as resonant, though, as either section, but fills in harmonic holes beautifully. So by resonant, I just mean the sound doesn't protrude or produce and sing as well in a hall or in a space as well as the violins or the celli. Now, on the other hand, the celli are very good at both purposes of playing melodies or supporting textures, and they just have a very rich and full sound all around. They also have a great dynamic range and a very wide playable range, so they can reach pretty low notes and they can play very, very high notes, which is why cellis are used so much for melodic purposes. And then finally, we have the double basses, which are typically used to lay the harmonic foundation. So they outline the bass notes. They can play melodies at times, but usually they wouldn't because the sound itself kind of clogs up the rest of the arrangement very easily. So the basses typically play either sustained textures in the bottom or kind of short notes to kind of chug along, depending on what the context is. So any of these sections, like violins, violas, cellos, and basses, can be doubled together for a thicker sound or just more prominent in the mix, right? So for example, the violins and the violas could be doubled in unison if you want a stronger melody, or maybe you want the violas doubled an octave below the violins. So this will help the theme or the melody protrude a little bit easier in the context of the fuller mix. All right, let's dive into the woodwinds. So again, we talked about how the woodwind family has a very unique signature throughout, right? So that starts things off with the flute and the piccolo. The piccolo is like a really small flute that extends even higher than the flute, but these are the highest instruments in the orchestra, and the flute can be very airy and very beautiful and very warm, whereas the piccolo can be very piercing and harsh in the higher registers respectively. Just so you know, these instruments are very, very common. The piccolo, because it's so harsh and so piercing in the higher register, we typically only need one of those in the orchestra, but the flute, you can have multiple of them. Then you have the clarinet, which has a huge playable range, very low notes, very high notes, and it's overall very agile as well and has a nice, full, warm sound. Very common in jazz as well as an alternative flavor. Then we have the oboe or English horn, which is considered like the doubler instrument. These instruments tend to have a slightly more nasal quality, but I think when you go into the middle registers, you get this really pining, rich sound, which I just love. Like the oboe is my favorite instrument in the orchestra. That's subject to change, but just so you know, I just love the sound and the tone that you get from these woodwind instruments. And then we have the bassoon, which is the lowest core instrument in the woodwind family and rounds out the section nicely. And it also doubles well with other instruments such as the cello and the French horn because they kind of have similar timbres there. All right. Then we have the brass family. So the brass features the trumpets, which are the highest brass instruments, and they're also very energetic and agile. So they can play short repeated notes, they can play runs, they can play extended notes, but yeah, they're quite flexible in their functions. Then you have French horns, which have a very great layering capability. So you can have multiple of them stacked on top of one another. And they feature a very warm and rich sound. And they also handle chordal textures and melodies beautifully. We also have the trombones, which are very strong and supportive. And they handle exciting textures very well as melancholic themes and melodies. Finally, we have the tuba, which rounds out the brass family and is quite thick and rich in the lower registers. So again, very similar to the woodwinds and the strings, you have instruments that round off all the high frequencies or all the high notes, instruments that kind of portray the middle sections, the middle registers, and the low notes as well. And then finally, we got the percussion family. So it's the most varied in selection, so many instruments in this family. And that, as a result, makes this section applicable to many situations. In terms of a core template or a core setup for percussion, typical instruments would include bass drum, timpani, cymbals, snare drum, glockenspiel, tubular bells. These are all very, very common in a symphony orchestra. The percussion family typically can be used to emphasize and accent certain moments, or we can just use the percussion to decorate existing arrangements and kind of spice it up a little bit more. We are kind of already touched on this, but again, that's what makes the percussion family so versatile. Other instruments could include the triangle, the tambourine, maracas, gong, chimes, castanets, celesta. It really depends on the context of your piece, but just so you know, the percussion section has so much variety and you're never really lost for choice here. So let's take a look at the typical seating position of a symphony orchestra, specifically in the Romantic period, but this is pretty common throughout most orchestral setups, I would say. So you can see how the strings are kind of spread out through the front of the orchestra. You've got the violins on the left, the second violins slightly more towards the center, then you've got the violas slightly more to the right, and then the cellos and double basses, the lower strings on the right extremes. Then behind that, we have the woodwinds, right? So because the woodwinds are quieter in nature, they're just behind the strings and they basically produce those beautiful colors that layer really well with the other sections. Whereas the strings, they're not the loudest section, but they are the foundation of the orchestra. So they set up the foundation really beautifully and the harmonic, the melodic foundation, whereas the other sections are kind of playing backup, if you will, or, more support to the string section. Then behind that, you have the brass section, which are quite loud. The brass are the loudest instruments in the orchestra, which is why they kind of sit at the back. And yeah, they typically can protrude very well through the rest of the orchestra, very beautiful colors, and they support the strings very well in addition. And then finally, we have the percussion, which is, again, pretty close to the brass. They kind of sit at the back as well, and those are used to highlight those key moments, maybe keep the beat or just emphasize certain key areas. And overall, the orchestra just, when set up in this way, you get a very balanced and rich sound. So when it comes to sample libraries, though, some do come pre-panned, like recorded in seating position, recorded in C2, or some are also panned up the center. So there are some libraries that no matter what instrument you're playing, the sound signal is completely center, whereas others, you'll hear the violins more on the left, the basses more on the right, because they kind of panned them that way and recorded them that way. But you have the freedom to choose how you want to set up your stereo image when it comes to the orchestra, which is a great feeling to have. I would typically put the melody up the center myself, and then I pan the supporting textures around that. So for example, like if I have a string melody, then I would want the brass to kind of wrap around it. So maybe I'll put some on the left, some on the right. Maybe I want a woodwind counter melody on the left, some percussion on the right, so that leaves room for the strings up the middle. There really is no right or wrong here, but I would say it just depends entirely on the context of your piece. Ultimately, I would say balance is key. So we're talking about volume balance, there's frequency balances, but also stereo balance. So you want to ensure that there's an even distribution of instruments or frequencies on the right and the left. So when the listener is enjoying your music, then they don't have to say, oh, why does this instrument or why does this entire piece of music sound like it's kind of biased towards my right ear or it's kind of like panned to the left? You want them to just be able to enjoy and have a nice experience, and that is basically created by a balanced mix and a balanced arrangement in general. So you might be asking, what about ensemble sizes? Like, how do I choose what size to actually use for my piece of music? Well, the smallest you can get are solo instruments, right? Just one at a time. So these can be used in a raw and intimate context because, again, they produce less sound and you get the full sound of the one instrument by itself without it being covered by others. Then we have chamber ensembles, which are a little bit larger, but they still retain the detail because it's not that many instruments. Whereas when you have something like a symphony ensemble or symphony orchestra, then you don't really hear singular instruments anymore, but you hear them as a whole. So this creates a larger than life sound, a very expansive and rich tone that you don't get with just solo instruments. The size that you choose is entirely based on context though. So what does the piece call for? Are you trying to create a more intimate piece of music or do you want it to be more expansive and large? And that kind of emotion, that vibe you're going for will influence the instrument choices that you make. So just remember, for example, like if a solo instrument, like a solo viola or something, is performing on top of a symphony orchestra that's also playing, then the arrangement should be more sparse, right? It should make room to allow that solo viola to shine. Because if you have everything playing at like fortissimo and the just the one instrument solo playing, then it's going to be swallowed up by the rest of the orchestra because everything else is so loud. So thinking from the perspective of the performers and how all the balances kind of work together is very, very crucial as an arranger. Now, that being said, there are some keys that you can think about to create full and balanced orchestrations. Number one, and this is more of a musical one, is to think about the harmonic series. So theoretically, you want to have wider intervals at the bottom, such as octaves, maybe even like fifths, because those are more perfect intervals, and then more narrow ones at the top, so seconds and thirds. If you maintain this kind of balance, like wide at the bottom, narrow at the top, then you'll get these full orchestrations, full arrangements that sound balanced, because that's just the way sound works. The overtones of certain low sounds really build up very quickly, and so they can kind of create muddy and washy sounds that you don't necessarily desire in this type of context. I would also adjust the patch volumes frequently. So what it doesn't matter what sampler you're using, but let's say it's in Contact, you have a bunch of instruments loaded. You want to make sure those volumes are kind of balanced with one another, so you're not getting fooled and you're not being told a different story with the volumes of the different instruments. So like if you have violins and violas playing together, maybe the violas are turned down so much that you don't hear them at all. And so they're being lost, right? And you might have to substitute the violas with another instrument when in reality, your violas are just soft. It's just quiet. So you just want to make sure your volumes are appropriate and you're hearing every instrument in your arrangement. Also, I strongly believe that we should give the ear something to pay attention to at all times, whether that be a melody or a harmony like a chord progression, or even just ear candy like fluttering textures or ostinatos. We want to keep and maintain the listener's interest 100% of the time. So there's many ways you can do that, but as a general rule of thumb, I would consider, any sort of texture that you want to use to keep the experience positive and give the listener something to feel and something to listen to always. So as a general rule of thumb, this is my personal approach, I would orchestrate the theme first, the main melody. So let's say in this case, it's a violin or viola ensemble. Then you want to orchestrate around that with the rest of the ensemble. So maybe that's the low strings because we've already used the higher strings for the melody, right? You might also want to use the woodwinds and the brass to fill out the harmonic holes and the low end as well. So depending on what you're using for your core lead melody, because that's the most important thing, the melody is king, right? So as a result, you also want the orchestration choices there to be very deliberate. Well, then after you get your main theme and your melody orchestrated, then creating the supporting textures through orchestration becomes more trivial. So then you can ask yourself, what instruments have I already used? What instruments are remaining? And how can I achieve the texture I'm looking for by using those instruments in good ways? Okay. So, when it comes to virtual instruments in general, there's a couple of techniques I can recommend to help with realistic mockups. Number one is to record your parts in live, one at a time. Even if you're not a fantastic pianist, you certainly don't have to be. But just being able to play basic melodies and chords on your keyboard, on your MIDI controller, is so useful. Mainly because you get this humanistic feel, and the way you play in a line with volume and dynamics and expression, like that is not something that's easily recreated when you are just playing in notes with a click, playing in notes with your mouse, and just manually putting one note at a time. So when you play your parts in live on the MIDI controller, you're actually performing the part, which is very useful, very very effective, I would say. Also, you don't want to quantize 100% in orchestral music. So you want to leave some room for a humanistic feeling. You don't want all the instruments to be exactly on the grid because that could sound robotic and kind of like a machine gun. So you want to have the notes slightly off the grid so there's a bit of a human feel to it. Also, you want to make sure you use volume and expression for sustain-based instruments, and usually this will create natural dynamics that a lot of sample libraries come included with, let's say strings. If you're playing a string line that's legato, for example, you don't want it to all remain at mezzo piano or something if it's like a lead melody. Maybe you want to start quieter, but you want to really soar up into the higher dynamics, and you want to do that by using your volume and expression parameters. Also, you want to aim for consistency in microphone positions. So maybe this is like a tree mic that you want to keep consistent for all your instruments. For like, you don't want just a close mic for the woodwinds and then the far tree mics for the brass. That would just sound like they're not recorded in the same space. Consistency is really just so key here. And then also you want to ensure that the volume balances across your instruments are appropriately set while working. This is something that you're doing constantly. So when you're playing in a part, you make sure the volume is appropriate. You can hear the instrument and it's serving a necessary function, right? Always be checking your volume, always be tweaking the faders or the actual volume adjustments within your sampler of choice. And that will give you the most realistic representation of your orchestra. So just please consider this tip, okay? There must always be a reason for why an instrument plays anything. You don't just want to put in instruments for the sake of putting them in. It's not going to be that helpful. It's actually going to overload your mix, and it might even overwhelm you because you have so many tracks and you just don't know what each one is doing. So for example, like a flute, right? If you're putting in a flute, is it performing a solo melody? In that case, it's very necessary. Or is it doubling the violins to create maybe more texture to it? Is it adding air to a specific ensemble, right? So you should always have a reason for putting an instrument in your arrangement. As a general rule of thumb, I would say less is always more. Always try to achieve a certain result with fewer instruments than too many instruments. Great question to ask ourselves is what I'm adding enhancing the overall arrangement? Or is there another instrument performing that role already, and so this instrument is actually redundant? A really specific example of this is for me, sometimes when I'm putting in ostinatos into a fuller arrangement, maybe I already have a violin ostinato that is performing kind of a sort of rhythmic element, right? I might find myself trying to put even more rhythm in there by using another string patch that's playing maybe spiccato or just repeated rhythms, but then I have to listen back and say, oh wait, that string ostinato is already playing this rhythmic aspect. So maybe I actually don't need this additional spiccato patch, right? Because then it could actually confuse the listener and give them too much information to listen to. So you definitely don't want to put the listener in that kind of situation and headspace. You want to make it as easy for them to consume your music as possible. So here's my general orchestration process, and then I'll show you a quick example of how I actually applied this in my day-to-day work. First of all, I have to ask myself, what is the context of this piece of music? Is it intimate and expressive, or is it large and bombastic, right? So depending on that, that's going to inform and influence the ensembles, the instruments, the size that I'm going to choose for my arrangement. Number two is after I decide on the context and I know what instruments I want to use, then I orchestrate the melody first. So maybe that's a solo instrument, maybe that's a full ensemble, but I really want to nail down the melodic orchestration first because then the listener has something to listen to and really focus on and pay attention to, and have the rest of the orchestra and the ensemble supporting it in the background. So after I do the melody, then I'll orchestrate the supporting textures. So maybe that's accompaniment patterns like short strings or warm brass. Maybe there's sustains or just shorts, but everything behind that to support the main melody then gets laid in afterwards. Finally, I'll lay in the other touches, final touches, whatever needs to be in there, such as like, runs or counter melodies or ear candy, just to lift that arrangement to the next level, give it that final polish before I go into the mix. And then I'll just listen multiple times through just to see if anything else needs tweaking. So I'll close my eyes, I'll play the piece from start to finish multiple times, and if anything stands out to me as kind of being a weird or kind of rubs me the wrong way, or something just pokes out that's kind of undesirable, I will fix that, because this is my last chance to get the arrangement polished and perfect before I move into the mixing phase. And the mixing phase is all about taking those recorded instruments and making them work together and sound as good as possible. So, mixing is not about changing the notes and the arrangement. It's all about tweaking the tracks themselves so that they work together beautifully. So the arrangement and the orchestration process is all about making sure the instruments that are there for a specific reason, and you want to make sure that there's no outliers or anything that's kind of ruining the arrangement before you go into the mix. So without further ado, let me quickly show you an example of a piece I put together that I've orchestrated, and I'll walk you through my thought process when it comes to that sort of thing. All right, so here we are in the session. This is called Love's Rapture. This is a love theme I put together recently, and I just wanted to show you some of the orchestration choices I made here. So let me just play through maybe the intro all the way to the end of the large section, and then I'll kind of dive into the process. So enjoy. Hear the violins on the top and the lower strings kind of playing those counter melodies, those moving lines. Right, and then we have the flute that's kind of doubling the main melody. Or sorry, no, that's actually the oboe or the English horn. And that creates a fuller texture there. So there's no main melody here just yet, but it's kind of being led by the violins one, and then everything underneath is essentially being taken along for the ride and supporting it through different chord voicings and just making sure it sounds full and rich, again following the harmonic series. Then here we get the main theme. So this is very, very simple. We just have the solo viola and just the piano for accompaniment. When you hear this, notice how the viola is playing in a higher register than the piano. So the piano is essentially staying out of the way of the viola. It gives the viola a lot of room to breathe and shine. So have a listen. Relatively low chords there in the piano, right? But it just provides that harmonic background for the viola. Now here in the second half of the verse, you notice that we have the violas and cellos also coming in to warm things up, timpani and string tremolos to kind of create suspense, and then the violins take over. Many more instruments here. The flute is doubled with the violins. Harp, more percussion, right? This emphasizes the downbeats, cymbals, and bass drum. More counter melodies here in the lower strings. Solo cello to double the melody an octave below for extra strength. And then in this following section, we actually get the flute, which is doubled with the oboe, I believe, or the English horn. That overtakes the melody. Then the strings take a more of a backseat supportive role to then carry that momentum forward and make it as lush and full as possible while not overwhelming the main melody. So overall, I basically orchestrated the melodic elements first, and then I decided what do I want the background elements to be and how do I want that to support the main melody. And then I just literally played in one instrument at a time. It might look overwhelming at first glance, but it's absolutely possible if you think about it from a more simplistic and color perspective. So if I want my melody to be more expressive and more romantic, maybe I will use strings like violins, and maybe I want more eeriness to that sound, so I'll layer in a flute as well. Well, to contrast that, or to support it, maybe I need the rest of the string section below it to give it that harmonic foundation. And maybe I want some percussion to emphasize certain downbeats and certain important moments. And then maybe I'll want some, string runs or harp glissandi to decorate the entire arrangement. But you literally just build one instrument at a time, and that's the whole art of virtual orchestration. It doesn't just appear on its own. Like, it takes careful, deliberate work, and it really is just so worth it in the end. So just to quickly recap here, you should think about the orchestra as a color palette with lots of options to choose from, right? There are so many instruments that you can go with. Each one has its unique color, its own unique timbre, dynamic and playable ranges. So once you kind of understand those timbres in depth and listen to a lot of music, then you just expand your palette. You have so many choices to go with, and choose deliberately for certain purposes. Don't just choose randomly. Make sure every instrument you put in there has a specific purpose. And also think about the perspective of the performer. So if you were the string player, or if you were the brass or woodwind player, what would you enjoy playing? Probably something a bit more melodic and something that has shape to it and natural contours, maybe not necessarily holding the same note the entire time, right? Or just playing the same staccato note for hours, right? You probably want to give them something interesting to play. So thinking melodically, thinking horizontally, this is a big, big thing to think about. Also, just to internalize the sounds of the orchestra and instruments in general, listen to a lot of live recordings. I can just highly recommend this because this is exactly what I did to learn orchestration and virtual instruments, literally just by listening to my favorite scores. Of course, I also went to live performances, but the fact that you have so much media that gives you access to music right away, there's really no excuse. You have to listen to music. You have to internalize the sound of the orchestra to really write for the orchestra. For me, it's a must, I think. Also, you kind of want to digest multiple genres of music to form your own style. A question a lot of people ask is, how do I actually form my own sound, right? Like, I have these influences and I don't want to sound like these other people too much. I want to have my own sound. Well, if you combine different influences from different genres that you enjoy listening to, then you can't really help but form your own sound because you're incorporating different influences and different styles into what becomes your own style. So I can definitely recommend that. You also don't want to overdo your arrangement, right? Balancing is key. So again, you want the least, or minimum effective dose, right? You want to get the most results out of the least material possible. If you can do that, then you basically have a good foundation in orchestration. But at the same time, don't be afraid to experiment. So maybe sample libraries have certain combinations or have certain sounds that you wouldn't have come across before, and take advantage of those moments where you're feeling inspired. Like, try out new combinations, doublings, try out new articulations that you might not have tried. That's the beauty of sample libraries. It's just that convenience and flexibility of trying whatever you want, using whatever instrument you want. You're not really able to do that with live orchestras, So don't be afraid to experiment and just have fun with the process. And that's basically it. That is a general overview of virtual orchestration. Hopefully, at this point, you kind of understand how I like to approach orchestration, and you can incorporate some of these tips and techniques into your own workflow to take your orchestrations to the next level and overall just feel more confident when it comes to mocking up your own music. So before you go, just make sure to download the free orchestration guide, 5 orchestration mistakes to avoid. Again, we'll cover the 5 key orchestration mistakes that amateur arrangers make. You'll also be able to think about the orchestra in a more musical and expressive way. You'll learn idiomatic writing techniques for best results, creating realistic and convincing mockups. And finally, you'll learn some good practices for balanced chords and full textures. Sometimes in order to know exactly what to do, we have to know exactly what not to do. So this guide will basically cover those 5 core mistakes that we've all made at some point, and hopefully you can avoid these, and you'll feel a sense of freedom and confidence when you are arranging your next mockups. It's really practical stuff. I really want you to have it. So click the first link in the description box and you can download it absolutely free as my gift to you. Thank you so much for watching, my friend. I really appreciate it. And let me know your thoughts below, what you thought about this. If you want more material like this, just let me know and I'll absolutely do that for us, for you, for me, for all of us. All right, my friend, take care. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.